So yesterday in the Superflex Supershow Discord, Zach Reed brought up a very intriguing thought that I just kind of had to look into and try to answer. And here is his thought. Do you have an understanding of where fantasy points come from? Like a breakdown of what actually drives points to what degree, rushing yards, receiving yards, receptions, etc. It might be interesting to have data on and slash some understanding of this to be able to attack places where the consensus under or overvalues certain means of production. So to me, when I first heard this, it kind of brought up the idea of the Konami code quarterback or trying to get receiving running backs. These are things that we've kind of heard in the fantasy space as things that we need to attack in our fantasy profiles. And I kind of assumed that these sort of things are already priced into ADP, already priced into consensus values. I've speculated in the past that maybe the rushing component of quarterback production was a little bit undervalued. In the past, we had Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud and these pass-heavy quarterbacks, these pocket passers, high up in Dynasty ranks without that rushing floor. And I kind of, even Mahomes, I kind of have been a little bit concerned about those guys when they were earlier in the first round of startups, in Superflex startups. But that's kind of changed. We see mostly rushing quarterbacks towards the top. But I think it's worthwhile to actually look and see where the market might be undervaluing certain types of production. So I have this master spreadsheet. I started off pulling data from last year, their points per game, receiving yards, rushing yards, passing yards, receptions, everything. Every player's previous season production in each category that goes into fantasy points. I then also have their age and their keep trade cut value. But I then, in order to handle age, this is something that has been kind of hard to do when modeling dynasty value, but I figured it out in the past. I just had an epiphany one day of just using Adam Harstad's estimated years remaining, which takes age and essentially adjust it for position. And so you can essentially turn age into more of a linear variable, just simply kind of cheating off of Harstad's homework and just saying, okay, this age is equivalent to this amount of estimated years remaining based on their position, right? And so we can have this estimated years remaining value, and we can have their points per game value. And what I did was I created a model at each position where I figured out, okay, what is the age value that each player has and what is the points per game value? And I figured out through running a linear regression model that there's specific weights that correlate to KTC overall value pretty well at each position. It's slightly different. I trained a different model on each position, but we have about a 27% weight on age value for quarterbacks, and then 73% value on points per game value. And we have about 34% age value for running backs and receivers, and about a 66% points per game value for running backs and receivers as well. And it's somewhat similar for tight ends, as you can see. But the overall idea is okay, how can I use just age and their finish last year, their points per game last year, and predict or estimate what their value in Dynasty should be, by KTC, what should their KTC value roughly be? And when you do that, these models, they explain about 70% of the variance, 70 to 75% of the variance in keep trade cut value. And so they're not telling the whole story, right? Age and production alone are not completely explaining KTC value. They're getting most of the way there, though. And so when you're looking at this, it's like, okay, well, every player, their age value is roughly weighted the same. There's slight variation. Same with points per game value. So we can approximate, because this is only accounting for like 70 to 75% of the variance, we can approximate that like points per game, and I thought this was really cool, but points per game explains about 45 to 50% of the variance in keep trade cut value, right? Their previous season points per game. That was fascinating to me, that was the case, right? It's only about half of it, right? The other portion of it is, unexplained variance in the value of their age. But to be able to actually like sort of definitively say, okay, yeah, like Dynasty value is half what they did last year, that's pretty cool to me. And it makes intuitive sense, right? And so I found out roughly what their total age and points per game value was, and that's obviously not their entire Dynasty value, but it's the majority of it. It's like 70 to 75% of it, right? And so using that, though, like you can determine how much of their Dynasty value is due to their points per game of the previous season. And so what we were trying to find out is kind of how much each kind of metric in their previous season was like what percentage of their points per game was it. So I'm going to spare you a lot of like the calculation details and kind of try to jump right into it. And so essentially what I did was, knowing how much Dynasty value is points per game value, like the percentage, but I can take it a step further and say, okay, what is the percentage of their KTC market value that is tied to their receiving yards in the past season, their rush yards on last season, their pass yards, and et cetera, right? And so from there, though, I can then multiply this by roughly 70 to 75% of their KTC value, because like I said, the age and points per game only explains about 70 to 75% of variance. I can then multiply that by the 70% of their KTC value and get KTC value approximates for all of their stats. So it's really cool because you can see, okay, Jackson Smith and Jigba had about 2,500 KTC value points, or has 2,500 KTC value points based on his receiving yards per game last season. That to me, I think is very cool to see, okay, how do these KTC values, how are they made up? What are they made up of, right? And so you can do this for every position, and you can see, okay, how much of their value was made up of this specific production point, right? And so that's cool in and of itself, but it's not super actionable, right? Like, what do you do with this? I don't really know. But what Zach was saying is that, he wants to see where the market is maybe undervaluing stats, right? And so to me, that means, okay, which stats are more predictive or more stable? Which parts of their value are going to be more consistent year over year? And comparing that to the actual value that they have, right? Looking at the differential between their kind of market value and their like kind of stable value, the consistent parts of their value, you can try to find players that are undervalued and also find the general stats that the market's undervaluing, right? And so in order to do that, you can do this test. And so I took stats from 2022 to 2025, and I looked at the kind of per game stability year over year, right? And doing so, I was able to create this little chart here, which you can zoom into. And these are our square values between the stat and the next year, right? Now I filtered this to players that had 2,000 plus in KTC value in the year prior, and players that had 6 or more games, just to ensure that I was getting like players that are actually fantasy relevant. And we can just look at the R square value of each stat. So receiving yards per game is only a 0.38. So receiving yards per game across the sample for running backs in one year versus the next only explains about 38% of the variance. So if you take year N, the previous year, it only explains about 38% of the variance in the next year, what their receiving yards per game is. And so for receivers, it's about 50%. So it's much higher. Their receiving yards per game is more stable at the receiver position. And that's also true at receptions, right? Now, if we look at touchdowns, passing touchdowns, rushing touchdowns for quarterbacks are some of the most stable for touchdowns, but they're not particularly stable for passing touchdowns still. But if you look at receiving touchdowns and rushing touchdowns at both running back, receiver, tight end, they're not stable. They don't correlate from one year to the next. Players' touchdowns can fluctuate, right? And so that we often hear fantasy analysts talking about touchdown regression candidates. That is a good example of kind of how that works, which is it's just kind of random and fluctuates from year to year. If a player had a lot of touchdowns in a previous season, there's no guarantee that he has a bunch of touchdowns in the next season, right? And so this right here is pretty telling. This shows us, which stats are the most stable, right? But then what I did was I was like, okay, well, I think if we just simply weighted all of these stats by their stability, we could get a sense for what their stable value is. How much of their production value can we expect to kind of continue on, right? We're going to say, so you're roughly saying like, okay, well, if somebody had, 100 receiving yards, you're saying that their next season expected receiving yards is like 50, right? It's not exactly what I'm doing here because I'm using KTC value. So it'd be like, okay, if you had 1,000 KTC value points in receiving yards, and the stable value for their receiving yards would then be half of that, 500 KTC value points in receiving yards, right? So it's simply doing that. And you calculate something that I call the stable value. The stable value is pretty much just weighting every piece of value that they have in these different production categories. And then it's saying like, okay, what's the most stable? What's the most predictive? And I'm adding it up to get a total stable prior year points per game KTC value, right? And now these are all lower than the just overall production based KTC value, right? Which makes sense, right? You're multiplying numbers by like percentages, and so that's like you're bringing it down, right? So it's kind of like a weird, wonky way of doing it. I don't really know how else you would do it, but that's kind of what I've got. And so initially, I just took this value and I subtracted it from this value to find the difference between the two, and players that were, higher in one or lower in the other, after scaling it here putting it on a 1 to 0 scale, putting both of them on a 1 to 0 scale, it spit out some results, right? And essentially it was just like, yeah, every receiver is undervalued, and every quarterback and running back and tight end is overvalued. And I was like, okay, well, that doesn't seem correct. And people in the Discord pointed to me, they're like, hey, specifically Jay, he's like, hey, um, it doesn't look like you're accounting for scarcity here, positional scarcity here. And so then I just like quickly spun up a value over replacement calculation here, where essentially all I did was I took a pretty basic league that has 3 starting receiver spots, 12 teams, Superflex, 2 flex spots, and I said, okay, hey, what's roughly the position rank that is kind of the replacement level, right? So at quarterback, I found it to be quarterback 30, running back 30, receiver 41, tight end 14. That's like a rough replacement level calculation based on the wins above replacement in one of my leagues that kind of has like a pretty basic rule or setting set up. And so then I'm able to say, okay, the 30th ranked quarterback in total prior year points per game KTC value, this is just like the overall, is about 1350, right? That's about what they have. And so to calculate the value over replacement for the points per game KTC value, you just kind of subtract that value from all quarterbacks, and you do that at each position. And then I did the same exact thing for stable points per game KTC value, right? And so from there, I'm like actually accounting for replacement levels, right? So it kind of helps a little bit. And so here I have the total prior year points per game KTC VORP, the stable value, the stable VORP, and then I've scaled it on a 1-to-0 scale for both of them, and then subtracted one from the other. So players that are, if we sort this, we basically have a list of players that are undervalued based off of stable value, where they're higher in stable value than they are in the total production value. And then players that are overvalued, which is they're lower in the stable value, higher in the total points per game. So I think the thing that's happening here is like, okay, Jahmyr Gibbs is awesome. Why is the stable value lower on him? Well, it's most likely because he got a lot of receiving usage, and the receiving hasn't really been that sticky for running backs, and he got a ton of touchdowns, right? So those things, maybe it's not true for Jahmyr Gibbs, but generally are not stable, not as stable, right? And so that's why the model here is like, hey, this guy's a little overvalued based on, if we're just like taking his points per game from last year and incorporating that into his value, like, okay, hey, some of what made him that superstar and point, like value wise, some of that what he was doing was a little unstable, and maybe it won't continue. I'm not saying that is true, that I even believe that. Like, I think Jahmyr Gibbs is a great player, and I think this doesn't really account for the projection of a player. Like, obviously David Montgomery's no longer there, so that's a big part of his 2026 projection, and that's not in this, right? That's probably within all the projection signal is probably within the 25 to 30% of variance that age and prior year production don't account for, right? So this isn't perfect by any means. This is just like a rough calculation. I'm like, okay, how much value are players getting from each category, each stat, and where is the market overvaluing or undervaluing players, right? So to get like an overall view, because Zach's question, he wanted to know like which stats are maybe undervalued or overvalued. And I think if you just look at this correlation matrix, where it takes this like undervalued metric, lower equals more overrated, this column, and looks at the correlation between that and their overall like production value, but at each individual stat, it kind of tells you, okay, which stats are responsible for a player's underratedness, right? And so at receiver, we see that, okay, reception yards and receptions, we see that receiving yards and receptions both are a positive correlation where, okay, just being productive is like a kind of a signal that they're underrated. Which it seems odd. Like, it seems very odd that the market wouldn't be pricing in receiving yards and receptions properly. But it seems like it might be true simply based off of the fact that those stats are very stable. They're some of the most stable stats we have, right? And at quarterback, we got rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. We know that the Konami code is real. Rushing quarterbacks do provide a lot of value, and they have a lot of stability, right? That those specific ways of scoring fantasy points are predictive. And so if you're looking for, I guess in this case, it's sort of cheaper fantasy points, it seems like it could be found in receiver in general and in rushing quarterbacks. Who would have thought the receiver thing though? I don't know if that's right, if I'm doing something wrong, or some sort of calculation is off, or this is just completely biased. But it appears like receiver, we might not be pricing that in. We might not be pricing in their production appropriately, which is very odd and something that I never even really considered. And then at tight end, I think we just don't really have that big of a sample size of, a lot of good tight ends. So I think there's a little bit of weirdness going on there with small samples, where we could probably expect the top tight ends to have similar numbers realistically to receivers. So I think if we group that together with receivers, that's fair. But running back was weird. I mean, literally nothing. I mean, everything had a negative correlation with being underrated. So I think it's kind of a statement on the overall position that these stats aren't stable for running backs, because a lot of their production is based on the factors around them. And so it's very odd. I know that the top end running backs probably are a little bit more stable year to year than the population of all running backs. And I know that the top end running backs that are getting a lot of receptions, they're going to have higher stability in that regard than this suggests, right? But it's not like I'm looking at a lot of bad players. I filtered it to guys that are above 2,000 KTC value points. And so it should be showing me all like fantasy relevant guys. And so the fact that I'm not really getting much of a signal here, it either suggests that running back is overvalued sort of as a whole, or they're maybe just appropriately priced in general. Because if we look through all the running backs here, let's see if we filter us. Like, we have our top end guys, I think, but like it's not by that much on most of these. Like, the valuation difference is really small generally. So I don't really know what to make of this. Maybe they are overvalued, maybe they're appropriately priced. I think it's a little dangerous to, when you go saying like, okay, a whole position group is over or undervalued. Like I said, wide receiver is probably undervalued based on this research. But I think this is sort of inconclusive, ultimately. Like, I would take it kind of with a grain of salt that receiving work at running back is not as stable. I know from past experience that rushing is not as stable. So really, I think maybe amend that receiver thing to include receiving for running backs as well, because the top end receiving running backs are generally going to continue to get receiving work, right? There's just not many of those types of backs in the sample that get a lot of receiving. I think for that to show up in the stability numbers, but just have that in mind that like a lot of these top players are just built different, and there's not enough historical data to really quantify their stability. But you can kind of use your common sense and know like, okay, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to catch a lot of passes, right? But yeah, if you want to find value in the dynasty market, I think you do find it in the rushing quarterbacks. That's something that I've generally harped on. And you want receiving, like at running back and receiver. Like the receiver production is just apparently not appropriately priced. I think. I don't know. We will see. That's the cool thing about dynasties. We never know if we're going to be right, if something is going to be right until years later, right? So if you've watched this far in, thank you for watching. I spent a lot of time working on all this research, and it kind of bums me out that it comes out sort of inconclusive. And even if it is, it's a lot of stuff that we already kind of know. Like we already kind of know that rushing quarterbacks are kind of a cheat code. We already know that you want receiving for your running backs. The receiving for receivers result is a little unexpected. And so I don't really know what to do with all of that. But I can pretty comfortably say that, like, yes, you want to target running backs that receive and quarterbacks that run. But yeah, thank you for watching. Bye.